The Words of the Covenant by Paul Hennerberry, more popularly known as Dr. Reluctant, was published in 2021. And this book is kind of like a transformer. It's more than meets the eye. First, because of the length. The print in this book is small. I'm holding a copy of this book, and there's not a whole lot of length difference between the Words of the Covenant and Adam Harwood's book, Christian Theology. They're actually both similar in length. Harwood's book is a little bit longer, but not substantially. So the first thing to know about Dr. Reluctant's book is that this is a long book. He covers a lot of ground. In this book, he introduces not one, but two frameworks through which to view biblical theology. Although I'm not sure he would use that word to refer to both of them, that's what I'm going with. In the Words of the Covenant, the reader is introduced to the creation project and an alternative to covenant theology and dispensationalism, which is known as biblical covenantalism. I think it's much closer to dispensationalism than it is to covenant theology. In biblical covenantalism, the good doctor is encouraging the reader to do two things while reading and studying the Bible. First, view the Bible through the biblical covenants as your guide. Those covenants specifically laid out in the Bible, such as given to Noah, Abraham, Phineas, David, and the new covenant through Christ. And also, second, to note that the nature of the covenants are the unbreakable and unchangeable words of God. Now, this review is of volume 1 of the Words of the Covenant, which walks the reader through the Old Testament using Hennerberry's framework. And volume 2, which is not released as of this time, will cover the New Testament. Now, there's no way I can go through all of this book in one Rev Reads review. I just want to give you my overall thoughts on what I experienced when I read the Words of the Covenant. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to learn the importance of the promises of God given in the Bible, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with my most current reviews. And also, please like and share this video with other people to help them know about the work of Paul Hennerberry. So I'm going to start with my one negative. This book needs an editor to shorten it down. I felt like at times he was covering some issues that, while good, and I was glad Paul wrote on them, they were too far off the main purpose of the book. His other option, though, and I think this might be the better one, and that is once volume 2 comes out, which I'm guessing is going to be just as long and chunky as volume number 1, what we need from Paul Hennerberry is a short summary version that is about 100 to 150 pages on biblical covenantalism, similar to what Michael Heiser did. Michael Heiser wrote The Unseen Realm, and then he wrote a shorter version to introduce people to his ideas in a book called Supernatural that was about 150 pages. So, biblical covenantalism needs a short 150-page book to introduce the concept to the reader, and then following that, they can dive into the 2-volume Words of the Covenant. But while this book is really long, I did feel that what's inside of it was very good. I'm a dispensationalist, and I found his critique and criticisms of dispensationalism to be spot on, simply that the covenants in the Bible should be viewed as a better guide to understanding biblical history than the dispensations. I, for one, am a dispensationalist because of the hermeneutical principles of the movement and not for the sevenfold division of history that is known as the dispensations. So I would say that if you're a dispensationalist, you will find this book either to be a welcome alternative to dispensationalism, or what I'd say probably how this would be more likely used is that this is a sister framework that can sit comfortably right alongside dispensationalism. The structure of the Words of the Covenant is simple. In part 1, which is about 17% of the book, Paul covers the importance of the biblical covenants, the nature of covenants, and why Jesus Christ is the key of the entire biblical covenant viewpoint. The remainder of the book, which obviously is the bulk of it, is a walk through the Old Testament, section by section, book by book, looking at all the places where the covenants drove the story forward or were a key part in the narrative of the Old Testament. The length of this book is necessitated in a large part due to the massive project that was taken on to cover all the Old Testament passages that relate to the covenants, and some that even do not. And for one, I'm glad to have read it because it helps me to better understand how crucial God's faithfulness to his covenants are throughout Scripture. This book shines a light in going from promise to promise and covenant to covenant in reading through the Bible, especially in those places where God grounds his actions and his words during the time of the later prophet writings in the covenants which he made earlier in the Bible. To be frank, if he didn't shine a light on this point, the book would probably be pretty far off topic. But his main point that the covenants of God are fixed and inviolable, and also the driving point of the narrative is shown throughout the entire Old Testament. And it surprised me going through this book how often the covenants come up, especially in the writing prophets, to point to the faithfulness of God to his word, and that being the reason why his people should continue to trust in him. I think we might miss how often those covenants come up and the roles they play in the narrative because we're too often looking at the trees of the forest and not the overall whole forest to see how much those covenants drive the story. So what this book sort of does is it allows you to take a step back, look at this wide view of the Old Testament, and to learn just how much the covenants of the Bible drive the story. And it's kind of shocking to see how much they do, and also how many times God himself points back to his previous covenants as evidence for his own trustworthiness. God will bring out 2 covenants in this passage, or he'll bring out 3 different covenants in another passage, or you have Jeremiah 33 where God brings out 5 different covenants he had made earlier in the Bible, making it far more important, as Hennerberry argues, than we typically give it. And it's very often just overshadowed by Jeremiah 31, which is kind of a shame. His writing on Abraham and how much Abraham needed to depend in faith on what God literally said was really important. Remember, in the key text of Genesis 15, Abraham questions God. Abraham calls on God to fulfill his promise of descendants. But we don't find God weaseling out of his promise and saying, "Oh, Abraham, you're going to have spiritual children who believe the same way you do." No, God doubles down on his oath that Abraham will have physical children. God keeps his promises, and God not only keeps his promises throughout the Old Testament, but he keeps his promises in such a way that they would have made sense and the way they would have been understood by the original recipient of those covenants and promises. God's covenants are not a bait and switch deception. But God's covenants made in Genesis are brought back up in the time of Ezekiel, and they're shown with those prophets that they're still valid, even though they're 1,500 years old. And God is still making plans to fulfill his word. After reading this book, I've really come to the conclusion that one of the most important character traits that any believer in Jesus Christ can develop is to take God at his word. Hennerberry calls this a hermeneutical principle of most importance, but I think there's a lot of application on how it can relate to our own character to be people who take God and his promises at his own word, as they are literally written. I loved the emphasis in the book that God has spoken as a way to be understood, and the Bible is all we need in order to understand him. So even if you don't like the idea of replacing the dispensations for the covenants, I think what you'll find throughout this book is instruction that will be helpful. And one of the most helpful things about it is I don't know how you could not read this book and come away more confident in God's promises and taking God at his word. For me, the words of the covenant is a very easy recommendation. The only thing I wish is that before reading this, I had a more digestible 150-page version of the overall framework that Hennerberry's trying to bring out on the nature of covenants, and a book that walked through the specific words of the covenants in Scripture and just gave us a short book on that, and then dove into this book. But hopefully that book will come in the future after Hennerberry watches this review and says, oh man, Shawn's a genius. I need to do exactly what he said in his review. I don't know if that ever happens, but I'm hoping one day it will. But if you want to understand the importance of God's covenants in Scripture, and you also want to find spiritual encouragement in remaining steadfast on the promises of God, this book will help you on both of those ends. And I can't think of a better book that I have read that covers the covenants of the Old Testament, how God delivered them and meant them to be understood. So thank you so much, Dr. Reluctant, for the work that you put in bringing this book out.